to their futures. Soldiers speak out.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm really, really happy to see all these friendly faces of Olympia. I'm Molly Gibbs, and I was asked to introduce Medea. Thank you, thank you. And it really does warm my heart to see all of you. It has been a long, hard summer. My little venture with third-party candidates has been eye-opening. So we're in it for the long haul, and we're the folks who are going to make a difference. I'm just delighted that Medea's here tonight, and I know most of you know the history of Code Pink, Global Exchange. She has done absolutely fabulous work, and her presentation is what I love. It is succinct, and then she has things for us to do that are very clear and make a lot of sense. So I think we're in for a very informative evening, and I would suggest that maybe if each of us could leave tonight and take the information, because we'll have video clips. She's got several different presentations, but we'll be able to link to a video clip and then forward that to people who aren't here tonight. And if each of us do that, we'll have helped spread some important information. The things that I most love about Medea are just her amazing way to get a group of people organized and to arrange for folks to do important work in a safe way and have a really well thought out strategy. I was just amazed to meet Medea. At the time, George W. Bush was signed up for his second term of office, and she went into the room where he was inaugurated and did a protest in that room. And when I was introduced to her, I just fell in love with this woman's incredible energy and commitment. So we've had the pleasure of being reunited. It's been several years since I've actually seen her, and I'm just really happy to introduce her tonight. Enjoy the talk, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Molly, and many thanks for this beautiful venue of a nice independent bookstore. They are rare species these days, and also for the incredible work that people in Olympia do. And I must say, just being in the presence of the Coreys makes me so inspired. And thank you for everything. We've had a chance to travel to Gaza together. Amazing experience to see the outpouring of love as you travel around with Palestinians and Israelis. And I think here in Olympia, you've just got such heart and soul, and it forces change, I think, within the people who represent you, and inspires people around the country. And I think one thing that I learned from the Coreys is to really just lead with your heart. And I won't be as succinct as I was this afternoon, because I'm going to lead with my heart to tell why I started doing this book. And it was really a heart connection, because it was right after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and the media was telling us, don't worry, now we have smart bombs, we have precise weapons, we don't kill innocent people, we just kill the evildoers, as George Bush said. And I had started a human rights organization called Global Exchange now over 20 years ago, and we learned over the years never to trust what your government says, especially when it comes to things like war, and went to Afghanistan to see exactly what these bombs were doing. And I didn't even have to get into Afghanistan. It was just on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan where I met the first refugees of the U.S. invasion. And they were indeed innocent families who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. In fact, the first young woman I met was a beggar on the streets of Peshawar, right on the border. And I asked if I could go back to her home with her and learn about her story. And it turns out that she had been living in Kabul with her family. They were near what appears to have been a Taliban compound. And when the U.S. invaded, they hit her home by mistake. Her father and her were out, and when they came home, they found the home totally destroyed, and her mother and 2 brothers and sisters had been pulverized, basically, by this fancy new technology, this new weapon. And she told me about how her father had collected pieces of flesh that were hanging in the trees, and that was all that was left of his wife and 2 of the children, and carefully collected it, carefully buried it, said his prayers, and never talked again a day in his life, never worked again a day in his life. And this young woman, who was 13 years old, the same age as my younger daughter at that time, found herself the head of a household with no mother, a father who couldn't work, and 2 little brothers and sisters, and started marching them out of Kabul through dangerous terrain, through the Khyber Pass into Pakistan, where she tried to feed her family by begging on the streets. And that, to me, was the eye-opening example of how we don't just kill the militants, we kill lots of families. And got me started looking at this issue of drone warfare, the new way of waging war in the 21st century. And what I realized is that it's quite a paradox now, because after 10 years of war, the American people are tired of war. We're a war-weary population, and that is not just Democrats, progressives, Greens. It includes a majority of Republicans. As the latest polls have said, even a majority of Republicans say the war in Afghanistan is just not worth fighting, which is a pretty amazing statistic when you think these are still, with soldiers on the ground, still the 2 major parties talking about keeping our troops in there at least until 2014 and probably beyond that. And on the other hand, you have two other things happening. You have a Congress that is voted last week, had a chance to support Barbara Lee's amendment calling for a swift withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan. And while you have 7 out of 10 people in this country saying war is not worth fighting, you only had 25% of Congress willing to say, let's have a speedy and safe withdrawal of our troops. Then you have another thing going on, which is the same kind of polls that show people against the war in Afghanistan show an even greater percentage of people thinking that using drones to kill terrorist suspects is just fine. You have 8 out of 10 people, and that's not just Republicans, that's also Democrats, and that's also people who self-define as liberal Democrats. So imagine, we're talking about terrorist suspects. So you know what a suspect is, right? What?
Everybody.
Yeah.
Males of a certain age.
Well, yes, but we certainly know that people who haven't been charged and convicted of anything. And American people say that's just fine. And that's because they've bought this whole idea that drones are somehow a humane way of waging war. In fact, was at a meeting at the State Department where a woman from the State Department told me that the drones were a miracle weapon. And this echoes what Counterterrorism Chief John Brennan says, that the drones are surgically precise, ethical, moral, and they're even wise. The drones are wise. So it seems that a lot of Americans have bought this idea that these new weapons, of which we had only about 50 of them in the year 2000 and now have over 7,000 of them, some of them small, looking like hummingbirds, dragonflies, some of them the size to put in the backpack of a soldier. But the ones I'm talking about are the killer drones. Those are the size of a small commercial airplane, and they are being remotely controlled. So they're remotely controlled from U.S. bases for the most part, and they're either in the hands of the CIA or the Joint Special Operations Command, also known as JSOC, of the military. And when you think about how surreal this whole situation is, where you have pilots now who are sitting thousands of miles away in air-conditioned rooms and ergonomic chairs, they've never been to the country that they're surveilling, they don't know the people, the customs, the language, and they are killers by day, and then in the evening they go home to their families, or they, in this case, this is Creech Air Force Base outside Las Vegas. They could go play the slot machines, and some of them say how convenient it is to be able to live with their families and, you know, have a family life. Others say they actually don't like it. You find a high level of PTSD among drone pilots. But you also find some pilots who really want to be on the battlefield. And they say their biggest problem is boredom. That they signed up to be in the action, they signed up to be with their buddies on the ground, and they don't like sitting in an air-conditioned room. They also are allowed to kill on the basis of two things: a kill list, and also on the basis of suspicious behavior. So they're always looking for suspicious behavior because they want some activity. And among the slang that's used by drone pilots to identify somebody who they have killed is bug splat, because that is what it looks like when you're looking at a remote-controlled console and you've killed somebody. It looks like a bug that was squashed. And the people who are running away afterwards, they call the squirter. And they oftentimes send in another Hellfire missile to kill the squirters or to kill the rescue people who are coming in to help the people who were killed in the first round. So I mentioned that there's two authorizations for kill. There's one that's a kill list. These are called personality strikes. They're looking for an individual person. And it turns out that this kill list is something that Barack Obama is very intimately involved in. And you might have read a pretty extraordinary piece that came out in the New York Times on May 29th that talks about how the president invites his advisors in. They're in the White House on what they call Terror Tuesdays, that they look at these cards that resemble baseball cards and decide who is going to live and who is going to die. So you have a constitutional lawyer and, of course, a Nobel Peace Prize winner who is playing the role of prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner all at once. And as this gentleman up front just said, they also have said that they call any male of military age who is in the area where the drones are being used a militant. So you don't have to prove anybody did anything. They are just, by virtue of being in the area, they are a militant. They do say that you can prove your innocence, but that is only posthumously. That's only after they've been attacked. So we are using these drones. They were used very much in the case of Iraq. In fact, the Iraqis were very upset to learn that when the U.S. soldiers left, the drones stayed behind. And they were transferred from the military into the hands of the State Department. So now you have the diplomatic arm of the U.S. government, the State Department, operating its own fleet of drones, and of course using private contractors to operate those drones. You also have the drones that were in Iraq. Some of them are now over the border in Turkey and are used to provide intelligence to the Turkish government in its ongoing conflict with the Kurds. So puts the U.S. smack in the middle of another conflict we shouldn't be involved in. The drones were used in Libya, a very important example to look at, because when the discussion started about NATO involvement in air cover in Libya, there were people in Congress from the progressive wing, like Dennis Kucinich, to the conservative Republicans who said, we want to discuss this in Congress and see if we think it's a good idea. After all, we're supposed to be the ones that decide whether the U.S. goes to war or not. And the Obama administration said, no, in the case of only using drones, Congress has nothing to do with it because there's no U.S. lives at risk, so the War Powers Act doesn't come into play. So imagine the kind of precedent that has been set of saying that the executive branch alone can decide when the U.S. is getting into a conflict. We're also using the drones in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, and opening up new drone bases in several places in the Middle East, like Oman, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, as well as in Africa, in the Seychelles, Djibouti, Ethiopia, also off the coast of Australia. But the place where we've been using these drones the most is in Pakistan. Now, this is a program that began in 2004 under the Bush administration, and the Bush administration used it more as their first goal was to capture people and throw them in Guantanamo. And the drones were used rarely. In fact, there were 46 drone strikes under the entire Bush administration. But the Obama administration looked at Guantanamo and said, oh my goodness, first of all, Obama wanted to close Guantanamo, then realized how politically difficult that was, and also realized that it was going to be even more difficult for his administration to start throwing people in Guantanamo and then having to decide, would it be a civil trial, a military trial, what would you do if they were innocent? And remember, even though Dick Cheney told us Guantanamo was where the worst of the worst were, 80% of them, it turned out, were innocent and had to be let go. The Obama administration's legal team said that it would be cleaner to use drone strikes. And so they really upped the number of drone strikes. By 2011, they were doing drone strikes every 3 days in the case of Pakistan. Now it's down to every 4 days. The number of people killed, probably over 3,000, about 175 children killed. But we don't know who the vast number of people being killed are because, as I just said, a militant means anybody just who happens to live in the region and is old enough to have some facial hair on them. Now, I did mention that statistics showed that an overwhelming majority of Americans say they were in favor of using these drones. And when you sit and you think about it, the only conclusion I can really reach is that the American people have not had a chance to see or hear about drone victims. And raise your hand if you have seen a drone victim on a U.S. mainstream television station or a photo in a mainstream paper.
Not counting Democracy Now!
Yes. So look around and you will see nobody has raised their hand because you just won't see it. And just think about that we have been using these drones for 10 years, in the case of Pakistan for 8 years, over 3,000 people killed, and you've never seen a photo. And so how are the American people supposed to develop any sense of compassion for people who are killed, for the children who are orphaned, if they never get to see these pictures? And a friend of ours who takes these photos, I just want to read you a short thing that he says, which is, he said, there are just pieces of flesh lying around after a strike. You can't, most of the time you can't find bodies. So the locals pick up the flesh and curse America. They say America is killing us inside our own country, inside our own homes, and only because we are Muslims. Now, these pictures I'm showing are people who were not, they were hit by the shrapnel because, as he said, you usually will not find any remains. Here's another short description. It says, the Khan family never heard it. They'd been sleeping for an hour when the Hellfire missile pierced their mud hut. Black smoke and dust choked the villagers as they dug through the rubble. 4-year-old Zarik's legs were severed. His sister Maria, 3, was badly scorched. Both were dead. When their cousin saw them, he gently curled them in his arms, squeezed the rumpled bodies to his chest, lightly kissed their faces, and slid into a stupor. This was the compound of a man who happened to be away that night. The next day, he came home to find his son on the left, who had just graduated from high school, was dead, and his brother over here killed as well. His brother was the local school teacher and was not a Taliban sympathizer. In fact, fought with the Taliban about the importance of education and tried to teach the children that education was much more powerful than any kinds of weapons. And he left behind a young wife, a 2-year-old child, and hundreds of students who were not able to resume their education. And as I say in the book, they were left aching for revenge. And that's an important part to remember, because every time a Hellfire missile strikes, the people are left aching for revenge. Like in this case, when those remote pilots thousands of miles away thought they were seeing a Taliban gathering because there were a bunch of men with beards and turbans and guns, which describes most of the men in that part of Pakistan, and let loose these Hellfire missiles, killing over 50 people. This was actually a meeting of the community leaders. And so imagine the kind of resentment that's left behind after over 50 of the most respected leaders in the community are killed. So this young man, Tariq Aziz, is somebody who was also aching for revenge because his young cousin was killed by a drone strike. And yet he did not want to take up arms, and he was given an opportunity to do something nonviolent. And he went to the capital of Islamabad to meet with other drone strike victims' families and to talk for the first time to lawyers, because they never had a chance to see a lawyer. And these are Pakistani and British lawyers who came to learn about their cases and to see if they could use the Pakistani court system to try to get some kind of redress for these family members. They also realized that since journalists are not allowed into this area, they should train the young people to be citizen journalists. And that's Tariq Aziz in that middle right there. And he was trained in how to use a video camera, a still camera, and he was very excited about the chance to go back to his village and document the drone strikes. Little did anybody at the gathering know that the first drone strike to be documented after the gathering was the death of Tariq Aziz, 2 days later, killed by a drone strike, this 16-year-old. And it would have passed like any other statistic, another militant killed, except that he had just been in this room with all these lawyers. And the lawyers were furious, went to the U.S. Embassy and said, you know, why was this young man killed? And they said, well, he was a militant. And the lawyers said, first of all, he's 16 years old, and second of all, he was in a public venue for 4 days. He was staying in a well-known hotel in the capital city for 4 days. Why didn't you just send somebody in to arrest him and give him a chance for a trial? And of course, they got no answer, because it is, as we know, easier for the CIA in this case to just kill somebody. So the Pakistani people are really furious about this, and that is Pakistanis of all political stripes. In fact, the Pakistani National Assembly has voted 3 times unanimously to demand that the U.S. stop the drone strikes, and the Pakistani people have been out in the streets. They also had a poll recently where they looked at, of the Pakistanis who knew something about the drone strikes, 97% said they were against them. Imagine, that's virtually all the people in Pakistan. And yet the U.S. government, instead of listening to the voice of the Pakistani people or the elected officials, insists on continuing these drone strikes, and not only that, has now transferred this program to another country, and that is Yemen. In fact, just this week, the former national head of intelligence for Obama, Dennis Blair, who was pushed out of the administration because he was so against these drone strikes, he once called them dangerously seductive. He said that this is like a whack-a-mole policy, where you hit them in one place in Afghanistan, then they go to Pakistan, then you hit them in Pakistan, they go to Yemen, but that every time you are, quote, hitting them, you are creating more enemies. And so in Pakistan, the first drone strike under the Obama administration was in 2009. It was a drone strike that killed dozens of people. In fact, that first drone strike left 14 women dead, 4 of whom were pregnant, 21 children were killed, and of the dozens and dozens of people killed, they could only identify one person who they said had ties with Al-Qaeda. To show how counterproductive this policy is, in the case of Yemen, when the Obama administration started the drone strikes in 2009, there were maybe 200 people identified as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and they controlled no territory. Today, there's over 1,000 that are identified with these extremist groups, and they control significant amount of territory. And in fact, there was a really wonderful op-ed that came out in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago, written by a 23-year-old Yemeni activist, and he entitled it, "How Drones Help Al-Qaeda." And he said that it is driving people into the hands of extremists, not out of ideology, but out of desperation and revenge. And he also said that any gain that was made by killing a few high-level people was totally counterproductive when you look at the general results of using these drone strikes. In the case of Yemen, the U.S. government is not only killing people from Yemen, but killing American citizens as well. In fact, the first American citizen killed was under the Bush administration. Never hear about that case. And then under the Obama administration, raise your hand if you've heard of the case of Anwar al-Awlaki. So some of you have. For those who haven't, he was an American cleric. He was put on the kill list. He was killed by a drone in Yemen. With another American who was not on the kill list but happened to be in the, quote, wrong place at the wrong time, Samir Khan. And the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights, on behalf of the family of Anwar al-Awlaki, said, "We demand to see the proof that he was involved in activity to kill Americans." And the U.S. administration has refused to release any of that information. It went back into the courts now, but unfortunately, it seems like the courts are not have not been helpful in forcing the administration to reveal any information about what they call a secret program. So, not only that, the U.S. government killed the son of Anwar al-Awlaki 2 weeks afterwards. Now, these are pictures from a Facebook page. And it said on his Facebook page that he liked rap and hip-hop and swimming. He was born in Denver. His friends said he was just a plain old normal kid without any interest in any kind of politics. He moved back to Yemen because he was living with his grandparents. And when he was killed, there was a wonderful piece that came out in Esquire magazine this month that looked into the Awlaki family. And they had a description of what happened to Abdul Rahman, this young man. He said, "It was a night lit by a bright moon. They were sitting around a fire, a bunch of teenagers, and they were simply cooking and eating. It was reported that an Al-Qaeda leader was there and among those killed, but then it turned out that he was not there and is still alive to this day. It was also reported that this young man was a 21-year-old militant until his grandfather released his birth certificate that proved that he was a 16-year-old American. Yes, there is something called the fog of war, but what is certain is only this, that a drone crossed the moonlit sky that night, and when the sun rose the next morning, the relatives of Abdul Rahman gathered his remains along with the other teenage boys, gave them a Muslim funeral. His aunt said, "Some say he was collateral damage, that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he wasn't in a cave in Waziristan or in Tora Bora. He was simply a kid enjoying his time in the countryside. The ones that were in the wrong place at the wrong time were the American drones." So the U.S. government is using international law to say that it has the right to go around the world killing people because of the right to self-defense. I dedicate a chapter in the book to the legal issues because it's so important for us to be armed with legal basis for refuting this, because the U.S. has so stretched that definition of self-defense. It is supposed to be used to say if there is an imminent attack, somebody is about to bomb you, they have amassed troops at your border and about to attack, and you have given your enemy a chance to surrender, which you can't surrender to a drone attack. And we are killing people now, not that are about to kill us, but because we think that someday they might want to somehow do us harm. And the government is also saying that after 9/11, the Congress gave the green light to the Bush administration to use lethal force in the Authorization of the Use of Military Force Act to attack those who were associated with 9/11. Well, there's a problem with still using that to justify attacks today. Many of the people that are being killed today were 9, 10, 11 years old at the time of 9/11. How could they have been involved in the 9/11 attacks? And many of the groups, like the one in Yemen, didn't even exist at the time of 9/11. And then you might wonder, well, what's the legal justification for killing American citizens overseas with drones? And I think it would come as a big surprise to most Americans if they actually paid attention and learned what this government is saying. Because raise your hand if you thought as an American citizen you had the right to a judicial process. Raise your hand if you thought you don't have the right to a judicial process. Yes, you unfortunately are right, according to the Attorney General. Okay, see, he has said that Americans, it seems, are under the misperception that despite the fact that we are coming upon the 800th year of the Magna Carta, where people have fought for many, many centuries to have the right to a judicial process, that we Americans don't have that right, that we only have the right to something vaguely called due process. And when I looked for the response to Eric Holder when he said that to a group of law students, I thought I would just hear absolute shock rippling through the legal community, but the best response actually came from a late-night comedian called Stephen Colbert. He said, yes, the founders weren't picky. Trial by jury, trial by fire, rock, paper, scissors, who cares? Due process just means there is a process that you do. The current process, the president meets with his advisors, decides who to kill, and then kills them. If we are going to win our never-ending war against terror, says Colbert, there are bound to be casualties, and one of them just happens to be the U.S. Constitution. So, it's one thing if perhaps Americans think, well, we can get away with this because we're the only ones that have these drones, but that just ain't the case. This is not like nuclear technology. This is a simpler technology, and there are many countries that are producing drones and selling them. So after the United States, the number 2 producer is? Israel. Israel, number 2 producer. Israel is also a major user of drones, and as the Corys and others probably know, during Operation Cast Lead, when 1,400 people were killed, over 800 of them were killed with drones. And drones are not only used to kill people in Palestinians, they're also used to terrify them, because they send them in to buzz around the villages, and they have a word in Arabic for the sound of the drone, which is, they call it the sound of death, because you never know if it's going to drop a missile or not. Israel uses the fact that they have target practice on the Palestinians as one of their selling points. When you see the material they use to say why you should buy their drones, it's because we are constantly using them, testing them in battlefield, and you know what that battlefield is. And Israel does not have the kind of restrictions that there still is in the United States on selling to countries that are not part of the NATO allies. And so they're just selling all over the place to 50 different countries throughout Latin America, Asia, Africa. They're selling them to companies like Chevron and other oil producers who want their own fleet of drones to protect their resources in other people's countries. And there has been a long collaboration between the United States and Israel on these drones. In fact, the Predator and Reaper drone was first developed by an Israeli engineer working for the Israeli military. And then he left and came to Southern California, where he started building these drones out of his two-car garage, and then sold them to the Pentagon. And now those are the prototype of the drone that the CIA is using. So long-time collaboration. And then there is another country that every time there is something being produced says we can produce it cheaper and faster, and that is China. So China is producing lots and lots of drones as well. There is an arms race in drones. You have to wonder what the Chinese are thinking if they consider Tibetans and Uyghurs their enemies, and they're living right here in the United States. Why don't they drop Hellfire missiles on them? Or the Russians that are trying to get their enemies, who are the Chechens living in Europe or here. You got to think that eventually what goes around comes around, and that we should be very worried about the kind of precedent that we are setting for a world of chaos and lawlessness. But then you also got to worry about drones here at home, not coming necessarily from people who want to harm us overseas, but coming from our own government. So raise your hand if you think there's already a lot of drones here. And raise your hand if you think there aren't a lot of drones. And that's not fair, because Tig is with me, traveling with me, so he's heard this before. But there are not a lot of permits for the use of drones in the United States yet, because it's the Federal Aviation Association, the FAA, that controls the airspace, and they are very worried about these drones. They know that they don't have good visibility up in the air like a real pilot has. They know that the technology is still in its early stages, and they know that drones crash a lot. In fact, the Air Force has admitted that a third of their drones crashed. You might have heard of a big drone that's called a Global Hawk, one of the very large drones the size of a commercial plane, crashed in Maryland just about 6 weeks ago, and luckily it crashed in a swamp. That was a $176 million drone, one of the very expensive drones. So they crash a lot, and the FAA has been worried about our safety. So they've also refused to tell us who has gotten these permits, and it was only thanks to lawsuits by a group called the Electronic Frontier Foundation that we're starting to get this information out. And it turns out there's only about 200 permits that are current right now, and that they are in the hands of government agencies like the FBI, the Homeland Security, the Border Patrol that's using it on the southern and northern border, some of the companies that are producing the drones, some of the universities, particularly state universities that have programs with the military. And then there are about 30 police departments, including one very close by here in Seattle, that has its drones. Now, they are testing the waters using these drones. But the drone manufacturers are very upset with the slow pace of giving out these permits, because they're saying, hey, this is a growth market, but we need more markets to sell to. open it up in the United States. And so to do that, they started their own association, and now they have their own caucus in Congress. Imagine there is a drone caucus in Congress that thinks it's their job to address the urgent need to rapidly develop and deploy more unmanned systems in support of ongoing civil, military, and law enforcement operations. So there is a law then passed on February 14th that mandates that the FAA open up our airspace to drones completely by the end of September 2015. And this is for commercial uses of drones, law enforcement uses of drones, all kinds of uses. The drone manufacturers would love to see all of the 18,000 police departments in this country have their own fleet of drones. Well, there's a problem there too, is that there's budget crunch, and a lot of these police departments don't have money these days. But there is a solution to that one as well. What's that?
Federal money.
Federal money, that's right. So Homeland Security comes to the rescue and is giving out grants to police departments to buy the drones. In the case, for example, of this sheriff's department outside of Houston, Texas, they bought their own drone for $300,000 with a grant from Homeland Security. And they held a press conference. It looks in this picture like they also had to then re-equip their police and buy a new tank to all go with the drone and protect that little drone there. But they held a press conference to show off their drone, and they said that the CEO of the company that sold it said, well, you know, they're supposed to use it for search and rescue missions, that kind of thing, but it actually is designed to be weaponized. And it could be outfitted with tasers that electrocute suspects on the ground, beanbag firing guns called stun batons, grenade launchers, tear gas, rubber bullets, even 12-gauge shotguns. They can also be equipped with all kinds of thermal imaging, facial recognition, Wi-Fi network cracking capabilities, intercepting text messages and phone calls. So, if we allow this to happen, this could really alter public life in the United States. We've already lost so much of our privacy. This could lead us to a 24/7 surveillance society, which is one of the reasons why there is a coalition building of people who are left, right, libertarian, whatever you call themselves, saying we don't want these things in the hands of police departments. So we're going to pass around, raise your hand if you're interested in contacting your police department and asking them 3 very simple questions on here. That is, do you have drones? Have you applied to get a grant to have drones? What do you intend to do with these drones? And give them a piece of your mind about what you think about having the drones. And this coalition that I talked about that's broad-based includes folks like the Cato Institute. In fact, there is a very interesting collaboration between my group, Code Pink, and the Cato Institute right now, trying to say that no federal monies can be used to give drones to local police departments, and the very obvious thing that you couldn't use drones without a warrant. So we are working with people on the left like Dennis Kucinich and people like Senator Rand Paul to introduce legislation to address some of these issues. We're also trying to get local municipalities, cities, villages to pass no drone resolutions. So if you would like to see your city be a no drone zone, raise your hand. And if you would like to help initiate that, raise your hand and we'll give you a copy of this resolution. If we don't have enough, you can get them on the website that's called droneswatch.org. But it's very important to start sounding the alarm about this. Otherwise, it is predicted that in the next 10 years there could be 20 or 30,000 drones in our airspace. And then just some other things that we can do. One is that we held a drone summit, and there some of the legal people said that what we should really focus on is drones in the hands of the CIA, because it is so patently illegal. It's not a military organization, it's a civilian agency, and that the CIA has run amok with these drones, that even people in the military and the State Department say that. In fact, in this New York Times piece I mentioned, they said it's a joke how they laugh about how when the CIA in Pakistan sees 3 people doing jumping jacks, they call it a Taliban training ground and they send in the drones. So we are meeting with members of the Intelligence Committee in the House and the Senate, and we want them to know that there's a lot of Americans who want them to do their job. Like in the past when the CIA has run amok from Vietnam days or trying to assassinate people like Fidel Castro or Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, the Congress came in and reined in the CIA. The Congress is not doing its job now, reining in the CIA. If it were doing its job, they would take drones out of the hands of the CIA. So we hope you'll sign up. There's also a little box there to check to get more information. And there's another box that says Pakistan. And that is because we have been talking to folks in Pakistan, like this lawyer who used to be a corporate lawyer, gave up his job to work for free for drone victims. And he said to us that the Pakistanis, when women and children are killed, think that the United States, that's what the American people want. And he said, if that's not what you want, you have to prove it to us. You have to do something to show us. And so we have been invited to go to Pakistan and do an incredible march with thousands and thousands of Pakistanis that are going to join us as we try to march to Waziristan. This will be a Gandhi-style march, and we are planning it for the week of September 21st. We're doing it with tribal elders in the region. We're doing it with a man named Imran Khan, who is a famous cricket player who is now a political party and has been speaking out against the drones and leading huge demonstrations. We're doing it with women's organizations. It's going to be a very, very amazing, intense experience. And we are opening this up to people who want to join us. And I think it would be very important for 1 or 2 or how many representatives from this region could go. Because, you know, there's nothing like being able to come back and tell those stories of having met with drone victims and then meeting with your Congress people and your senators and going into your community organizations and your churches and other faith-based organizations. So you can check that box if you're interested. You can come and talk to Tig here afterwards about the trip. But it's going to be a very important way of showing the people of Pakistan how disgusted we are by this program. And you can go to the website droneswatch.org for any more information about this or other campaign ideas that we have. And before opening it up to discussion, I just want to say that it's so sad when you see how powerful this military-industrial congressional complex is, that it really doesn't matter who is in the White House, whether it's George Bush or Barack Obama, that the strength of this killing machine is so much more powerful than the strength of our movement. And we had a strong movement under the Bush years. We built up a movement where we could get hundreds of thousands of people out in the street. And you still have a very active community in Olympia because you have some amazing people, but you are not typical of what is happening around the rest of the country. The Occupy movement has given new hope to movement building. It's brought young people into the movement, and it's brought in people who really understand the connections between the 1% that profit from corporate power, whether it's oil companies or banking, or whether it's the weapons industry. They do understand that this is the same 1%. And meanwhile, it's the 99% around the world who suffer from this. And so I think we have the possibility of really building a movement with the new people who have come in to build something that is separate from political parties. Because let's face it, when Barack Obama came in, the peace movement around this country really fizzled out. And it fizzled out because people thought Obama was going to do the job for us. It fizzled out because people were tired from 8 years of fighting Bush. It fizzled out because there's a financial crisis, and a lot of people had to look inward at what's happening in their own families, their own communities. But it also fizzled out because of partisan politics. And unless we build a movement independent from partisan politics, we will always allow the war machine to be more powerful than we are. And we know in the case of Israel-Palestine how powerful the AIPAC lobby is. That this is a lobby that represents a small percentage of the population. And I say, as a person of Jewish faith, it doesn't represent the entire Jewish community, and we are just a very small percentage of the population. And yet it is so powerful because the money that it throws around. And in fact, it was today that President Obama signed a new agreement with Israel to show how we were going to even strengthen further our military ties with Israel, give them even more ability to buy the most sensitive military equipment that we have, give them another $70 million for the Iron Dome. And in the White House today was representatives from the Senate, from the House, and the head of AIPAC. So, and what was the reason that Obama did that today?
Because of Romney.
And because Romney is about to travel to Israel. And so they want to one-up each other about how close their ties are with Israel. And that reflects how weak our movement is. And whether it's about drones in Pakistan or whether it's about this obscene military ties that we have with the Israeli government, it all reflects on the need to build a movement that is independent from party politics. And the last 2 chapters of the book, and I hope you'll all buy copies of the book because we need this information when we talk to our friends and relatives and people who think these drones are a humane way of waging war. But it's also important because the last 2 chapters are about what people are doing. And the last 2 chapters are meant to give hope. And the last 2 chapters are celebrating the people like Father Louis Vitale, an 80-year-old Franciscan priest who keeps going on to the bases in the United States where the drones are being piloted and putting his body on the line and saying, "Not in my name." And it talks about people like Colonel Ann Wright who do the same thing, and the people, the Catholic workers and the Veterans for Peace who are doing it all over the country. And when one group does it in Creech Air Force Base, it inspires a group to do it in Hancock and upstate New York. It inspires a group to do it outside of Langley, Virginia, outside the CIA. It inspires people to go to the headquarters of the drone manufacturers in Southern California. It inspires them to go to Boeing in Seattle. Each one inspires the next one. And it inspires people at the UN to then say, "Hey, UN, why aren't you doing something about it? We've got to ban these lethal drones." So I hope that the book will be an inspiration to people about the kind of movement that is being built and how we have to strengthen that movement. And lastly, I just want to point out a study that I mentioned in the book that looks at 268 different organizations that were called terrorist groups in the last 60 years and what happened to them. And it shows that overwhelmingly they dissipated not because of military intervention but because of better policing and because of negotiations and peace talks. That only 7% were through military. We have done now over 10 years of using this military hammer post 9/11, this whack-a-mole approach, and it is indeed counterproductive. How long are we going to let a government, no matter who is in power, say to us, "You only have 2 choices. You have boots on the ground, let our soldiers be put at risk and perhaps die in these conflicts, Or you can have these miracle weapons drones where our soldiers won't die, but we will keep the killing going. We have to say, no, we demand a third way. We demand negotiations. We demand peace talks. We demand that you speak to these tribal elders instead of killing them. We demand that we have a policy that shows the kind of generosity that we as Americans want to show to each other in our movements like this, that this is the kind of foreign policy that we show to the rest of the world. So let's build that independent movement, let's ground the killer drones, and let's bring our troops home. Thank you.
Yes. First of all, I'd like everyone to know that the man filming is a member of VFP. Yes. We have a monthly VFP hour on TCTV. This will be shown. You can check the TCTV website for the VFP hour. This may be a couple months down the road, but you can tell your friends to watch for it. Thanks to Medea for letting us do that. We do it once a month. Secondly, you're going to start this march on September 21st, which is International Peace Day. Started in the UN in 1985, I think. I'm not sure of the date. Are you doing it in conjunction with that, worldwide, with other things?
Yes, we chose it because it's International Peace Day. And we're very excited that this is one contribution that we can make to the many thousands of things that will be happening around the world on International Peace Day. And I want to give a shout out to Vets for Peace.
You just mentioned all of my communities. As an American soldier who have done so many funerals of my own soldiers, and a soldier of Pakistani descent, who can understand what happened to people and can understand their words piercing through my heart, and those unforgettable words and images without any translation. What will it take? What will it take to stop this Orwellian nightmare upon us all? What will it take?
Well, it's going to take people doing some more intense kind of things. For example, there was a Veterans for Peace guy that we just met recently who wanted to go on this trip and to Pakistan, and he said, I would like to do a hunger strike in front of the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad.
Which one?
Which?
There are only about 6 of them in Islamabad.
The big main one, because we asked our friends in Pakistan and they said, great location, great idea, and we're going to see if we can get that going. That's the kind of thing that I think could spark a lot of media attention, a lot of interest. We are trying to bring drone victims here to the United States. We had a very hard time getting the lawyer, the Pakistani lawyer, a visa. When he was working for corporations, he had no problems getting in here. He had an expedited visa to come to the United States. When he started working for drone victims, he was persona non grata. And it took a campaign with thousands of people that we got contacting the embassy and the State Department to get him into the United States. Now what we want to do is get him in with some of the drone victims. So we're going to be working on that, and if we could get them in, we would travel around with them and hopefully get the mainstream media interested. So those are some of ideas, but we do need your ideas as well, and constantly open and looking for other ways to get this out to new audiences, to the mainstream media, and to get our elected officials to start paying attention to us. And one other idea I would throw out there, you know, before 9/11 happened, we had an amazing, growing global movement. And you all who are so close to Seattle remember WTO and what a movement that was, and the World Social Forums that have been bringing people together. That movement has dissipated a lot after 9/11. But we have to rebuild that global movement, because in a case like this, the polls show that 9 out of 10 people around the world think it's absolutely barbaric that the United States is doing this. They're really opposed to this. So if we reach out to legislators in other countries, they're really going to be very happy to have a way to express their disgust. If we reach out to people around the world and say, go out in front of the embassies, have a day where we do national actions, I think we can get a lot of support internationally. But we need lots of ideas to percolate like that.